What's going on? You listen to King Cam Ujumbe Podcast and Ujumbe means message. And yeah, we got a good one. I'm really excited about this one. Check this out. It is the Pharaohs versus the priests, or the Insubiti versus the Chijani, an epic battle for power. Yeah, I said I was going to get into it. So let's get into it. All right. Now, question is, was there tension between the priest and the king? By shout out to H. Rap Brown's Ghost. He asked the question. So we're going to get into it. But check this out. There is a fundamental difference between the two just by looking at the meta nature, by the hieroglyphics, by design, they are different. The priest and the king, or the king of Egypt, symbolically, phonically, very different. Okay, check this out. Here's a Shem, or they call it cartouche, but this is part of King Tut's name. But as you notice, there's that little bowl and three lines. That means he is the Lord of all people. Okay, those three lines means multiple people, various people. Of course, he's the king of the north and south, and the Zephyr or Kephat or Kephati, and then you can't see it, but the sun disk. So he is the Lord created by God himself. Okay, he is king created by God himself, that kind of thing, or God created him as king. On the other side here, though, we have the Vizier. The bowl, he's a Lord, but there's one line, though. There's one line. That means he's only leader over a certain specific group. So fundamentally, the king of Egypt and the priest of Egypt, two different. Okay. And they got the little baby bird there. Okay. And I'm gonna show you in a minute. Um, there's a baby bird, but then there's the falcon, right? So he is just the Tijani is just leader over a certain group of people. The king of Egypt, he rules over everybody, right? So check this out. Here's another example here where we in meta nature, or the statues, there are the falcon behind that king. Not a baby bird, not a little turkey or whatever. This is a falcon. This is a eagle, but they use the falcon. But that falcon, symbolic of him being over everyone, and that falcon being behind that king means basically symbolically saying that God is behind this person here. Pay attention to this person. Okay, so let's get to the business now. Dealing with the clash between the priesthood and the kings of ancient Egypt, this was a recurring thing. This was a recurring theme throughout its long history. The tension stemmed from complex interplay of political, religious, and economic power. We're going to get into that though. In Kemet, in Egypt. So the pharaoh was considered both political power ruler. He's a political ruler and the religious ruler. Okay. While the priesthood, particularly those serving the major Neteru, like Amun Ra, wielded significant influence over the religious and cultural life of the people. So the pharaoh was the symbolic ruler of the state, but then the priest said, "No, we represent the people." Okay, so let's go. All right, so Pharaoh's divine kingship, Pharaoh's divine kingship. Right, the pharaoh was seen as an intermediary between the gods and humanity, basically living God on the earth and the maintainer of Ma'at. Okay. Ma'at basically means justice and balance. If there is no justice and balance, it is chaos or isfet. Okay. It is chaos. So his authority was bolstered by his role as the head of state and military commander, enabling him to control Egypt's vast resources. Okay. Now, a little bit more. He was a representation of the Neteru. Okay. Now, this is one of my favorite statues. You've seen it all the time. This is the statue of Menkara. Okay. He's standing between Heteru on the left, and we have symbolic of the house, which, Heteru is the symbolic of the house of Heru, which means he, he is under that house. Okay. He is established in that house. So whatever he say goes. Okay. So on the left side, which is on his right hand side, is Heteru. Okay. On the on the right here is a personification of Hare the gnome. So this wasn't another Neteru per se, but this was a individual, the city personified in a person. Okay, so he as the pharaoh, as king of Egypt, he represented uh, Heteru, and as you can see, he represented the state or the gnome, right? Now, here's another one of my favorite pictures here where Heteru is seated, and then she got her arms around Menkare, which means she supports him. But there's another thing for my sisters, okay? Check this out. We will deal with Queens of the South in the spring, but in order for him to be ruler, it came through his mother. So the the power came through the mother. So that's the reason why she is now seated here in between them both. Okay. Wisdom, Heteru, the house of Horus. In order for him to even be the king, he had to be established through the house of Heru. Okay. Now, here it is. Now, the priesthood. The priesthood. Okay. Now, as Egyptian religion developed, temples became wealthy institutions, accumulating land, resources, and labor. So these priests, these people, had a lot of influence and a lot of power, and so they they ran it. Okay, so when you see these priests, it has something going on, right? So of course we have the priestly order, the high priest, the Himnetetepi. Okay, remember there's priestly orders, the high priest, for example, the priest of Amun, which of course before the Middle Kingdom, the Old Kingdom was the priest of Osiris, okay, the high priest of Osiris. So, but once uh Egypt evolved as a nation, they changed the letters from Amun, from Osiris to Amun. So we have the high priest, then we have the chief priests or overseers of the priests. Okay. It's Necha. All right. So we have the high priest, the chief priest, and then everybody else. Shem priest, the lector priest there, the, ordinary priest, or the Wa'a and the Wa'a priest, which we discussed this before. Now, here's the cause of conflict. Why was there conflict? We already understand that there's a fundamental difference between the kings and the priests, right? But here's the conflict. There's economic rivalry, political rivalry, and religious rivalry. Okay? There's economic rivalry, political, and religious. So, economically, money, the temples, especially those dedicated to Amun and Thebes or Waset, owned extensive lands and resources, rivaling the wealth of the pharaoh himself. So these buildings, these properties, these resources was a wealth in and of itself. And temples cost money. To build these temples, they cost money. All right, just like this one of my favorites, temple in Waset, that we discussed that is over 800 feet long in length, and it took quite a few pharaohs to build, and it cost money to build it. Okay, so how they do it? They did it through donation. Okay, donation. And so remember, when they paid for this, they had to pay for, say, uh, workers, farmers, artisans, masons, the lands provided grain. These properties, these temples provided grain, cattle, and other resources that rivaled the pharaohs. Okay, so these buildings created self-sufficient economic network that the state found difficult to control. So, but got to go along to get along, right? So the pharaohs, in efforts to legitimize their rule or curry favor with the gods, they often donated lavish gifts to the temple. Okay, so over generations, this practice resulted in the temples amassing precedented wealth and autonomy. Okay, so inscriptions on temple walls often recorded these donations, serving as both spiritual record and public declaration of the temple's growing influence. So The pharaohs played a little politics, okay? So they played a little into it, right? So pharaohs often commissioned art and inscriptions to depict themselves chosen by gods, okay, reinforcing their divine legitimacy over the priesthood. Conversely, the priesthood could invoke divine displeasure or omens to undermine the king, such as blaming natural disasters or military defeats on royal impiety. Now, this is one of my one of the statues of Ramses II. Okay, Ramses II. As you notice, his left foot is forward. Whenever you see that, fam, whenever you guys see that, that indicates that he is still living. Whenever you see a statue of a king at the of Egypt or queen of Egypt, and their left foot is forward, that lets you know that he was living, he or she was living at the time. Okay, so once again, they commissioned art, they commissioned statues, and they depicted themselves being chosen. Okay, being him. Right. Let's go now. So here it is, though. In periods of weak central authority, okay, when the economy wasn't strong, okay, in periods of weak central authority, such as the late New Kingdom, the temples steeped to provide stability, further solidifying their power. So when the money wasn't right and they sought out the Pharaoh, they believed that the temple, if that was taken care of, the people would be taken care of. This role, however, was a double-edged sword as it diminished the king's direct influence. So economically, the priests kind of wielded some power counter to the Pharaoh of Egypt. Okay. Now, there's another one. So we have economic, we have political rivalry. The priesthood, particularly of Amun, increasingly acted as a political force, influencing the state's decisions and even challenging royal decrees. They had enough power, get this, to challenge the king's rule. That's something, right? So remember, they were the scribes, so they had the paperwork. They had the paperwork. So they was able to erase or add to. They went to the schools, right? So they had the power over the deeds, the laws, and the edicts of that state. That's a lot of power. Okay. So yeah, we can say, yeah, the Pharaoh said this, but guess what we're gonna do? We're gonna change that to maybe. Right? Man, crazy. So a little bit more about it. By the late New Kingdom, the high priest of Amun in Thebes wielded the de facto control over Egypt. They were not merely religious figures, but political leaders with armies and administrative systems. Now, there were we're gonna get into this in a minute, but they had a lot of power, not just religiously or theologically, but they started to have muscle. Okay. I'm going to get into that in a second, which was very surprising to me. But get this. This priest and in the picture, this is what they wore. Okay. You have the leopard skin there, you have his apron, and of course, he's stepping out with his left foot. Okay. And get this, they had to earn that leopard. They had to earn the leopard skin. Okay. So they just didn't just put on something just to be putting it on because it was nice. All right. So, yeah, so they had economic influence and political influence, right? Now, religious rivalry. Now, this is where this is where it gets pretty sticky, okay? Pharaohs like Akhenaten, we're going to talk about him, sought to reform religious practices by promoting monotheistic worship of the Aten, directly undermining the Amun priesthood. You know, the Amun priesthood was something like gangsters, and they wasn't having that, okay? So we're about to get into that in a second. But they they did some things. They there was some fundamental differences, as you can see symbolically and through application, that there was a rift between the priest and the king. Okay. The priesthood often used oracles, allegedly communicating the will of the gods to influence political decisions. They was finessing the system. Okay, these oracles, okay, would validate or undermine royal authority depending on the priest's interest. So they used um the seers and the oracles to, and they kind of lined their pockets up or whatever. And so they manipulated the process. Now the people thinking that these priests are legit, or they think that the king is legit, but there's a sleight of hand that these people are playing chess and not checkers. They're manipulating the process. So, for example, okay, we're going to talk, for example, we're going to talk about what happened, what was the result of these conflicts in a second. All right. So, now get this. Question is, oh, I'll get back to it. Did Emotep, they got, Bam got real specific. They asked, did Emotep clash with King Joseph over ancient Egyptian power? H. Bryant asked that question. He wanted to know. He heard about some stuff, and he heard there was some issues between Imhotep and King Joseph. Right now, there's actually, after I did some research, there's no historical evidence or credible records indicating that Imhotep, the renowned architect, priest, and physician, clashed with King Joseph, the pharaoh of the third dynasty of Egypt. Instead, historical art and archaeological evidence suggests that harmonious relationship between the two figures. So, um, remember, he was credited in building the step pyramid. That was the first pyramid and a revolutionary architectural achievement. So they had to get along. They had to work together. Remember, because remember, this project was commissioned by Djoser, and Imhotep's work earned him a lasting reputation. So they had to work together. Okay. Ancient Egyptian culture often portrayed pharaohs as ultimate rulers who held divine authority, but for Imhotep as high-ranking vizier and royal advisor, to openly challenge his power would have been unlikely at the time. Okay. So them clashing, not so much. Okay. But what happens when pharaohs and priests do clash? Because there was some issue. We already talked about the fundamental issues, but what was the result of it? We know Imhotep and them didn't. Okay. But what happened? Okay. In the New Kingdom, during the New Kingdom, the cult of Amun became dominant, particularly under rulers like Hatshepsut and Tutmosis the third, who expanded the wealth and influence of Amun's priesthood by the reign of Ramses the 11th, the high priest of Amun had amassed so much power that they essentially ruled Upper Egypt. They ran that, okay, leading to the division of Egypt during the third intermediate period. Now, yeah, we got to deal with the obvious. Got to deal with the heretic. That's what they would call them, the heretic. The Amana period, Akhenaten um, attempted to centralize power by instituting the worship of the Aten, sidelining the Amun priesthood. Akhenaten's radical monotheism was a issue. It was a major problem. Okay, so his radical monotheism was not just a spiritual shift, but also a political move to break the economic and ideological stranglehold of the Amun priesthood. Okay. Um, so so remember, Atenism emphasized the direct worship of the sun's life-giving energy, with Akhenaten's position as role as intermediary between the Aten and humanity. So he replaced himself as the priest. Now, even though he and many others were were trained under the priesthood, but they, of course, and in time, they were not the same. Now, of course, his grand vizier, Aten, lived during the 14th century before Common Era, 18th dynasty. He served King Akhenaten, and he served during the Amana period. He helped implement Akhenaten's vision of centralized worship around the Aten, coordinating administrative reforms in the new capital, Ak Aten. Okay. Now, do you think, still ask the question, do you think that was necessary? Okay. You think that change was necessary? Now, remember, Atonism emphasized the direct worship of the sun, and Akhenaten disbanded the Amun priesthood. You know these folks didn't like that, especially the elders, the older generation who knew his mother and his father. They weren't for that, and so he redirected resources to the Aten's cult and defaced temples of Amun. So not only you took their money, you knocked their buildings down. Can't do that. So during the Amana period, you disbanded the priesthood and their stuff. He closed many traditional temples, stripped Amun's priesthood of its privileges, and erased references to Amun and the other Neteru in monuments. He did that. Now, remember, I know some of you guys may not recall, but when Tutmosis III came into power, he took down some of Hatshepsut's work. But that was more of a kingly flex, saying, hey, I am king now. But that was from a political standpoint. Akhenaten was doing this from a religious standpoint, right? Now, by relocating the capital to Aten and promoting the Aten worship, Akhenaten sidelined traditional temples, disrupting Egypt's established religious and economic systems. The backlash was immense. Temples restored, and the Amun's priesthood reinstated after his death. Now, this period became known as the Amana heresy. That's why I called him the heretic. Okay. Now, but he he did he it was other things that I think there was some other things that was happening. Understand, he was a family man. He loved his family, he loved his children, and you can see that in the imagery. But there was a lot of external forces that was coming into Egypt that he as king avoided. Okay. There was some things that I think he avoided. So um and it came back to bite him. Okay. Now, what was the difference between what was the fundamental difference between, say, the priest of Amun and the priest of the Aten? Now, Amun priesthood, I'm reading this from my notes. The hierarchical, the structure was deeply integrated by the state administration for the Amun priesthood. For wealth and influence, vast land holdings and temple wealth allowed the priesthood to dominate Egypt's economy. Theologically, Amun was the hidden one. So they already understood that that power behind everything, the unmoved mover. So that was them. So the Amun priesthood, they had a structure, they had money, and their theology, even though old, was kind of in line with the Aten, but you know. So the Aten priesthood, it was more centralized around the pharaoh, not around the state. It was around the pharaoh. And the role of the pharaoh was as the mediator. Okay. In theology, Atonism rejected traditional temple rituals, focusing instead of the open air worship and the sun's visible presence. So it was theologically, it was fundamentally different, where the priests of Amun would do their thing inside the temple, where the priests of Aten would be outside. Okay. Let's continue. Now, the third intermediate period, during this period, the high priest of Amun effectively ruled from Waset, while the pharaohs controlled the north of Tanis. Now, this division marked the decline of central royal authority and the rise of regionalism. Remember, I told you there was about 40 plus nomes, and each nome had their own noble or vizier, or state leader. But over time, that became a problem. That became an issue, right? So now, the temple had a military. Okay. Temples maintain their own military forces, protect their vast estates in times of political instability. These armies sometimes rivaled the royal forces. So the priests had their own military. Wow. Right. So during the 30 intermediate period, the high priests of Amun used their armies to enforce their control over Upper Egypt, effectively ruling as kings in all but name. So yeah, they had their own military. They wasn't just, praying and incense burning. They threw hands. They had their guide. They had their people. So my question is, did you know that the temples had their own military? I didn't. That's new. I always thought just the Magi was the army and they served Pharaoh. I didn't know that the priests had their own military. Okay. I didn't know that. So, and remember, this was a snowball effect. This is after, say, Akhenaten and the Amun priesthood reclaimed this power. And they knocked down the monuments and temples and got their money back. So they weren't, they weren't just weak and docile individuals. As you notice, I told you about that leopard skin that he wore. They had to earn that. They had to go out there and do it themselves. They didn't have somebody do it for them. Okay. And the staffs that they have in their hand, it wasn't just for show. And that little rod that they have, it wasn't for show. Okay. So now, during the reign of Ramses the 11th, the priesthood used oracles to consolidate the power to justify the control over large swaths of country. Now, at this point, this is Ramses the 11th. Do you think they were justified in trying to reset Kemet? What do you think? Comment below. All right. Let me know, because at this point, there was a lot of foreigners there. The Phoenicians were there. The Greeks was there. Do you think at this point they was done playing political chess and actually trying to bring Egypt back to the people, or make it Egypt of the people, right? What do you think? Now, what's next? That's all I got. But Queens of the South or Ladies of the North and South, that is next spring. But shout out to the fam for asking those questions. And so, but our next book, The First Female Pharaoh, Sebek Neferu, the link is in the description. As an Amazon affiliate, I earn from qualifying purchases at no additional cost for you. But what's next? We're going to answer some more questions. I had to get this one. Okay. And for more, check out Sister Danita Smith, Yahya Sabaka. He's really good. He told me to, don't forget about the different eras and different ebbs and flows of the golden ages. So check them out. And of course, more books. Temple in Man and Sacred Science is good. The Priests of Ancient Egypt, and of course, Stolen Legacy by Grandmaster George G.M. James. Sacred Space and Sacred Function in Ancient Thebes, Temple Ritual and Abydos. And that's all I got for you. Okay. Priest versus Pharaohs, the Insubiti versus Chijani. This is the King Cam Ujumbe Podcast. And I'll talk to you later.